That was the resignation that set off a whole chain of events. The subtitle question there from one of the journalists, this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Who can make sense of it?
Well, look, there are a couple of things here. I mean, he's given essentially two reasons. One is being away from his children. They are quite young, and his wife also has a very demanding job. I think you have to accept that reasonably on face value.
Except 150 days out from the London Olympics. It's a strange time to suddenly decide you want to spend time with your family.
And that's why the other sort of narrative has to be looked at more closely. And this is this idea that he says, you know, it'll be a gesture of healing. As a footnote, you know, the gesture of healing, Wayne Swan saying, you know, if we don't grow together, we'll grow apart. I think Labor's got a big line in Power Ballads coming on. But I think what he has basically been wrestling with this for a longer time than has been, you know, alluded to publicly, I think. When they went so close to disaster in the 2010 election, I think he had to think then about whether or not he needed to kind of go, if it had all gone completely pear-shaped for them, and had been sort of, you know, wrestling with this thing about always being the bad guy for a long time.
So he's just tired of having that reputation?
It's fair to say that there's been a lot of cynicism around Parliament about this, and for the reasons that Mish is saying, also for the reason that, you know, he was promoted in the reshuffle last December. That was when the conversation he alluded to with his daughter happened. He didn't go then. He accepted the promotion. He accepted the new job. So a lot of people looked at it and went, hang on, that doesn't really make sense. But the truth is, a week later, we have absolutely no evidence, no information of any other reason. So until you have another explanation, you have to accept the explanation that he's given, I think.
Just go on the available evidence, Dennis.
Yeah. As a number of people said, you know, you take it at its face value, or maybe its faceless value. But after he made that announcement, I talked to a couple of his very close friends in politics, and one of them made the point to me. They said that Mark Arbib had been absolutely consumed by this idea that he would only ever be remembered for one thing, and that was for being a faceless man who cut down Kevin Rudd. Whereas, you know, sort of, say, Stephen Conroy will be remembered for the NBN, Wayne Swan will be remembered for the dealing with the global financial crisis. Arbib's sort of, you know, his chapter heading is Faceless Man, and he hated it, and he wanted to try and make a break with it. Now, I understand that, but, you know, you don't often hear someone say, I'm getting out of this to spend more time with my family without another chapter. I think Tony Wright wrote during the week that usually the next thing you hear is, I can't recall that, Your Honour. But yeah, I don't think that I don't think that'll happen this time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then he moves on. Bob Carr moves in. Now there was a lot of confusion about that, and it centred on, I think, on Julia Gillard's initial comment at George Megalogenis's book launch when she said that the story in The Australian was completely untrue. If you take Craig Emerson's version of events, there was no mutiny and there was no offer, then the story was untrue. It was the use of the word completely which kind of suggested there was nothing in that story that you could rely on. Is that where she got into trouble?
Well, I mean, I sort of think there's been an attempt by the government to rewrite the history of the week pretty comprehensively, because there was a lot of things on the record that we know for sure. We know for sure Julia Gillard spoke with Bob Carr on Monday night after the idea had first been canvassed between Bob Carr and Sam Dastyari. Now, she says she didn't make an offer there, and I'm sure that's true, but clearly the conversation went a fair way down the track because Bob Carr was ready to fly to Canberra Tuesday morning for an announcement. Then he was rung and told, no, it's all off, it's not happening, and we know in that period...
And that phone call was made by Wayne Swan.
By Wayne Swan, possibly slightly sort of after he'd called off. I don't know if that was when he first got the news that it was all off, but Swan did call him on Tuesday morning and said, you know, no, it's not happening. And she had been lobbied internally by various people who were, you know, who would be who would not get what they wanted if Bob Carr came to Canberra. Now, that does raise questions about her authority, and it did raise questions about her honesty when she said the whole thing was wrong. By week's end, she'd asserted authority, it was all good. But I think we've got to be careful that they don't, you know, completely rewrite the history of the week to iron out the tricky bits.
I think there's another dimension to that completely untrue statement, which is a problem the government really has to deal with. A lot has been said in recent times about the dysfunction that we've had inside the government, especially under Kevin Rudd, and about the bad blood that existed in the leadership ballot. There is another dysfunctional relationship this government's got, and bad blood, and that's with the Australian newspaper. Every time the Australian newspaper writes a story which the government feels is negative and part of an attacking agenda, the government hits back with overkill. And that's what she did. She went too far. They really do have to sort out their relationship with the Australian newspaper, otherwise they won't be able to get that monkey off their back.
OK, and I would have thought that's easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. None of this is easy.
It was messy, the whole reshuffle thing, and then Bob Carr turns up on the Friday and he tried to hose down the sort of controversial aspects of it by explaining that all leaders have trouble with reshuffles. Here he is.
I remember in some sort of rage or frustration as Premier not getting away with a wayward colleague actually picking up a porcelain mug with a portrait of Chairman Mao just to demonstrate my foreign policy credentials and flinging it at the bookcase. And there's still, apparently in Barry O'Farrell's office on the 40th floor, there's still a dent, an historic dent in that bookcase. By those standards, this reshuffle was a mild affair. But in the end, it's the leader who cuts through.
And in the end, there are some disappointed people, as Craig Emerson pointed out. Stephen Smith, clearly one of them. Let's hear from Stephen Smith.
Do you think that you earn the Teamsman Award for 2012?
Well, look, let me put it this way. I've seen reference in the course of the week to some suggestions that there are entitlements in public life. There are no entitlements in public life. I don't have any entitlement to be disappointed.
Nevertheless, what's the upshot? What will be the medium-term impact of all of this?
Well, I think Stephen Smith is disappointed, and perhaps the one upside that he might find there is that his seat is now looking pretty marginal in the context of the sort of polling nationally. So he'll have a chance to staying in defence to actually spend more time in the electorate. If we had the foreign ministry again, he'd be off overseas every second minute. Look, I think Dennis made a really important point earlier, which is that the spillover from the kind of breaking of the dam that happened in the last couple of weeks, where people just suddenly started riffing openly about how much they hate each other, hasn't stopped yet. And we're sort of seeing it's like an earthquake, and you have aftershocks, and we're still seeing a bit of that now. Bob Carr yesterday was out there saying it's time for people to kind of rein it back in. Backbiting's got to stop. People have got to put this stuff, genie, back in the bottle. And again, easier said than done.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point. Anybody who's been involved in a domestic blue, and all of us have at some time, we remember them quite vividly. Usually when they reach a sort of a crisis point, they don't suddenly get better. It takes a time, and you still snarl at each other for a few weeks. And I think that's where the Labor Party is now. And
sometimes they don't get better at all, and that's what we don't know. And the fact that leaking is continuing has got to be a bad thing. On the positive note, Bob Carr is, I think, an asset to Julia Gillard's team, a positive thing for Labor. If for no other reason than he can communicate, he can speak in sentences that he makes up himself. He can deal with difficult questions in that sort of light-hearted manner that we saw at that press conference and move on. He is a good operator. So, maybe that's the positive news of the week.
And if you take Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there was a lot of words spoken inside and outside of the Parliament that are now redundant, total waste of time, because they were based on the wrong information. But when the opposition were making the point that you don't bring in an outsider, I thought Anthony Albanese had the trump card on that one. Here he is.
During the debate, I was somewhat stunned that the Queensland members over there sat there quietly and listened to the outrageous suggestion that maybe Bob Carr might be selected for something because he's outside the Parliament. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, two words, Campbell-Newman.
Now, I'm not sure Anthony Albanese's Queensland state colleagues will thank him for that, though, because it does rather make their argument harder that it was an outrageous thing for the blow-in Campbell-Newman to be coming and wanting to try to run and lead the party from outside the Parliament.